Stanford University.
So you've actually heard from some of the living legends of psychology in this course, people like Carol Dweck and James Gross, some of the most prominent psychologists in the field, but we're going to end the way we started the class, with a rising star in psychology, someone they'll still be talking about in 30 or 40 years. So it's my pleasure to introduce you to Christopher Bryan, who is a researcher at the Stanford Center for Longevity. And his primary research interest is how psychological science can help us understand really complex social issues and problems, and hopefully help us develop policy or programs or interventions to help deal with those problems. And he's going to be talking to you today in particular about one of those problems, the fact that most Americans do not save enough money for retirement, as well as related issues. And it's not just about saving money for old age. This is really what you're going to hear about today, has to do with investing in the future and how it is that each of us can be guided to make more intelligent choices, whether we're trying to influence our future health, our future happiness, or even saving the planet. So with that in mind, please join me in welcoming Christopher Bryan.
Thank you. Thanks, Kelly, for that great introduction. I'm actually not going to be talking about saving for retirement, but almost everything else you said does apply. Sure, okay, we can do that. No problem. Yeah, we can do that. What I'm going to be talking about today actually reflects two central interests of mine that Kelly sort of talked about, or at least alluded to. First, broadly, I'm interested in how subtle changes in framing, so subtle differences in how an issue or topic is presented, have the power to shape important attitudes and opinions and influence behavior in socially beneficial ways. And on another level, I'm interested in the role of the self in shaping attitudes and behavior. So I think the self concept, your sense of who you are, is never really fully settled. It's something people are constantly grappling with. What kind of person am I? What kind of person do I want to be? And these are questions we care a lot about. And so by connecting behavior or attitudes to these questions, it's possible to have a powerful motivational effect. And that's what I'll be talking about today. Yes, good. And so, just to be sure, the papers, that was the voting paper, right? Did you guys see that? OK, good. That's what I'll be talking about. And so, OK, so tonight I'm going to talk about a subtle psychological process, one that can be evoked through subtle means, but that has implications in a wide range of domains and contexts. The process I'm talking about has to do with whether or not we understand or see behaviors as having implications for our self-concepts. So I want to start with just a brief example of what I'm talking about. Imagine you're out for a walk and you've just finished enjoying a cold drink. And now you're left with this empty can and you'd like to be rid of it. So do you drop it in the first trash can you come upon? Or do you hold on to it until you can find a place to recycle it? I think a critical factor in determining whether you, determining what you do is whether you see recycling a can as just another behavior or as a reflection of the kind of person you are. And we make lots of decisions like this. Do we volunteer to help the poor? Help people out when they need it? Donate to charity? Run a marathon? Or take a stand on an important issue? Do we do the thing we should do, the thing that's good for us or good for society, even though it's hard or entails some sacrifice or expense? Or do we sit back and opt for ease, comfort, and convenience instead? And I think an important reason we sometimes do the hard good thing is that we like the way doing those things makes us see ourselves, makes us feel about ourselves. We like to think of ourselves as charitable, caring people, as good Samaritans, as people who are mentally and physically strong, and as people who stand up against injustice. And so I'm arguing that a lot of the things we do, especially the sorts of things that involve some personal sacrifice, but that are widely approved of, we do because we want to think of ourselves as the kind of person who does those things. Now, ultimately, the reason for this is that in our culture, it's really important for individuals to be worthy, competent, moral, generally deserving of approval. And our behavior feeds into our self-concepts. What we do shapes how we see ourselves. And so when we see behavior as having implications for our self-concepts, this provides a way to manage our self-concepts, to pursue the goal of being a worthy person by behaving in ways that are consistent with that view of ourselves. Now, of course, we do a lot of things, and not all of them are spontaneously seen as being relevant to our self-concepts. So all of you walked into this room and sat down in chairs, and I'm assuming most of you don't now think of yourselves, at least it's not salient in your minds, that you're the kind of person who walks into a room and sits down in a chair. It's just something you did, and it's not particularly significant. And so I've conducted a series of experiments in which I framed a behavior as relevant to the self, who you are or who you could become, expecting that this would make people behave more like worthy people. So to engage in behavior that's effortful but beneficial and socially approved, and to avoid behavior that's tempting but harmful and socially disapproved. I should note here that throughout the talk, I use the term self-concept and interchangeably with the term identity. By both of them, I mean more or less how we see ourselves, what kind of person we think we are. And I should have said at the beginning that you should please feel free to interrupt me with questions if anything's unclear. I don't know if that's the norm, but if it's not, you should feel free to do it with me. And so in designing all of these experiments, we drew on past research investigating how subtle differences in language can affect people's perceptions of themselves and of others. In particular, describing people with nouns can signal that an attribute is representative of their essential underlying character, who they really are. Now, just a couple of quick examples. First, one study found that even young children think another child described as a carrot eater has a stronger preference for carrots than one who eats carrots whenever she can. These are preschool-age children. Another study found that if you take an adult who likes Coca-Cola, who likes Coke, and you ask them to write, "I am a Coke drinker," they subsequently report liking Coke more than if you ask them to write, "I drink Coke a lot." It's kind of interesting. And so one thing is that all of this past research involved putting labels on people in the here and now. I am a Coke drinker. And it found effects on current perceptions of self or other, what kids say about other kids or what people say about themselves. In the work that I'm going to tell you about, we took an approach that's superficially similar to this past research, but with a twist that changes the psychology considerably. So we use nouns to refer to prospective behavior. So we weren't putting labels on people. Instead, we were essentially giving them an opportunity to claim an identity. We were signaling that the decision about whether or not to perform the behavior will say something about the kind of person they are. And using noun wording to frame prospective behavior in this way makes it possible to have a motivational effect, to influence people's behavior. And so the basic idea here is that noun wording, as we're using it, turns a more easily trivialized question about whether or not to engage in a particular behavior into a seemingly more meaningful one about whether or not to be a particular kind of person. And so what it's doing essentially is framing the behavior as relevant to the self-concept. This is going to affect how I see myself. Now, I mentioned that this psychology, whether or not we see behavior as relevant to our self-concepts, has implications in a broad range of contexts, and I've explored it in a range of domains. And so just to give you a bit of a preview for what I'm going to talk about, I'm going to start by examining the general idea that framing behavior as relevant to the self-concept motivates beneficial, socially approved behavior. And I've looked at this first in the context of voting, one type of beneficial and socially approved behavior, and then among young children in the context of motivating preschool-age children to help others. After that, we'll look at whether the converse is also true. So does seeing behavior as relevant to the self-concept deter harmful, socially disapproved behavior as people seek to avoid a negative view of themselves? And we'll look at this in the context of efforts to deter cheating. And then I'll close by discussing some of these implications for our understanding of the nature of the self-concept and its power to motivate behavior. And so in a first set of experiments, we looked at voting. Voting was a great context in which to test these ideas. First, it's obviously an important behavior. There's nothing more essential to democracy than voting. And yet huge portions of eligible citizens fail to vote in even the most important national elections. So turnout has rarely exceeded 60% of eligible voters in recent presidential elections, and has rarely exceeded 40% of eligible voters in recent midterm elections. And voting involves a personal sacrifice. It's a hassle. And you know your individual vote isn't going to make any objective difference in the outcome of an election. In fact, some theorists have pointed out that from the standpoint of individual self-interest, voting is irrational. The costs far outweigh the benefits. But importantly, people widely approve of voting. They think it's a good and moral thing to do. This is evident in the popularity of those "I voted" stickers that are commonly handed out at polling places, and in a recent Facebook function that allows people to advertise to their friends that they've voted. People want others to know that they voted. And so being the kind of person who votes, whoops, went backwards, a voter, may be seen as a way to be a good or valued person in our society. And so just to sort of formalize the hypothesis here, what we're hypothesizing is that framing voting as relevant to the self-concept, as symbolic of the kind of person one is rather than as just another behavior, will motivate people to vote. And so experiment 1, which if you read the paper is actually experiment 2 from the paper. I cut a couple of studies for the sake of time. Experiment 1 was conducted the day before and morning of the 2008 presidential election. Our participants were 88 native English speakers. Remember, we're using this noun-verb difference, right? It's quite a subtle difference in language, and so we thought it would be best to focus on people who are native English speakers. So 88 native English speakers who were registered to vote in California in that election. And what we did was we assigned them to one of two groups. People in both groups filled out a brief 10-item online questionnaire about their thoughts and attitudes about voting in the upcoming election. The content of each question was identical in the two groups. But what we did was we manipulated the phrasing of the question such that voting was either referred to with a verb or with a noun. So in the verb condition, for example, participants were asked, how important is it to you to vote in tomorrow's election? In the noun condition, they were asked, how important is it to you to be a voter in tomorrow's election? After participants had finished that questionnaire, their active participation in the study was complete. That's because many states, including California, make available their official state voting records for academic research. And so we were able to just sit back and wait until a couple of months after the election, and then get access to those records and use participants' names and dates of birth, which we'd collected along with other demographic data at the beginning of the survey, to look up whether or not each participant had voted. And here's what we found. So participants in the noun or to be a voter condition voted at a significantly higher rate than those in the verb or to vote condition. Now, I use the term significant. This is a statistical term. It essentially means very unlikely to be a fluke, right? It means, in this case, it means we're very confident that this difference was indeed caused by the noun versus verb wording difference and not by chance factors. Now, statistically significant is different from practically significant, but this difference was also practically significant. It was a difference of 13.7 percentage points in voter turnout. And it occurred as a result of a tiny manipulation in the phrasing of 10 questionnaire items that framed voting as a way to claim or reclaim a desirable identity. And so in response to this tiny manipulation of identity relevance, people took a significant chunk of time out of their Tuesday to go and stand in line and vote in this election. Now, of course, this was the 2008 presidential election, which arguably was a rather special election. There was lots of excitement at the time, at least, about Barack Obama. And so it's reasonable to wonder whether this sort of finding would occur in a more ordinary election. You could imagine, for example, that the prospect of being a voter in such an exciting historic election would be more motivating than it would be in a normal election. So one thing we wondered was, would we find this in a typical election, or was this something where we were lucky to have looked at it in this very unusual and exciting election? Another big question about that first study had to do with the average age of participants. So we just collected a sample of the first people we could get. We had a very tight window, right? It was the sort of 24 hours before the polls opened. So we got whoever we could get in that time. And who we could get amounted to a group of people whose average age was just under 24. And the reason that matters is that there's past research suggesting that, and this probably won't surprise you terribly, younger people tend to have more malleable self-concepts. So they're just a little less clear on who they are, right? And this could be really significant for a manipulation like this one, where we're essentially relying on the malleability of people's self-concepts, right? We're relying on this desire for people to craft a positive view of themselves. And so what this slide amounts to is we wondered whether this effect was broader or was limited to these sorts of people in this election. And so to look at that, we ran a second experiment in which we used a larger, more diverse sample in a much more ordinary election. So experiment 2 then was conducted the day before and morning of the 2009 gubernatorial election in New Jersey. This was one of these off-year elections. It wasn't sort of associated with any sort of presidential race, obviously, or anything else particularly exciting. So really the definition of an ordinary election as statewide elections go. The sample this time, participants were 214 native English-speaking registered voters in New Jersey. And this time they were all members of a survey research panel administered by a professional survey research firm. And that's significant because their pool is a representative sample. And so now that allows us to make inferences based on the results of this experiment to voters at large in New Jersey at least, right? Because we're limited to New Jersey. Average age this time, much better, much older. So this time an average age just over 54. And one other small improvement in how we did things this time was that we made sure that participants weren't aware when they were being invited to participate in the study that it had anything to do with the upcoming election. And the reason that's important is we wanted to make sure that we weren't biasing our sample in favor of people who are more interested in the election, right? And so we recruited them and then we said this is about the election. And then, like the previous experiment, the treatment involved a brief online questionnaire about participants' thoughts and attitudes about the upcoming election, in which we manipulated the phrasing such that it referred to voting either with a verb, to vote, or with a predicate noun, to be a voter. And also, as in the previous experiment, we were able to get official state records from New Jersey, the state of New Jersey, to determine whether or not each of our participants had voted. Okay, and so what we found in this experiment was that, again, participants in the noun or to be a voter condition voted at a significantly higher rate than those in the verb or to vote condition. So this was, again, a statistically significant difference and, again, a practically significant difference. So this time, a difference of 10.9 percentage points. Yeah?
What were the survey results themselves? Did they match any voting results?
No. So interestingly, there weren't reliable group differences in how people responded to the questions. So what we think was happening is that the questions were really just a pretext, right, to expose them to this noun versus verb way of thinking about it. And we think that what it did was it just changed the way they thought about voting, but interestingly didn't affect how they responded to this. And that's partly because the questions weren't intended to be particularly revealing of anything we were terribly interested in. What was the question? How important is it to you to vote? That was probably the best of the questions we asked. And the other ones, and the reason was we didn't want to ask any questions that would be, have a big effect on what they did. We tried to ask bland questions.
Did their answers predict voting?
No. I'm not confident in saying no because I looked at these data, a long time ago now. But no, I'm pretty sure no. Yeah, and again, some of these questions were. I'll give you an example. how consistent are your thoughts about voting with your feelings about voting, right? Things that were intended to be almost meaningless, right? The point was it sounded like something a psychologist might ask, but it was a pretext to expose them to this way of describing voting.
What would be the version of that question using a noun?
Oh, so sorry, here, let's just go back. Here you go. So, the one I just gave. So how consistent are your thoughts about being a voter with your feelings about being a voter in tomorrow's election with your feelings about being a voter? Yeah. So anytime we said voting, we replace it with being a voter. Yeah, exactly. Any other hands? Yeah.
So I noticed on the verb condition, it was also a pretty high turnout compared to sort of, do you think that's also an effect of just having taken a survey about voting?
Yes. Wow. No one ever anticipates that. But yeah, there is some research to suggest that answering any pre-election survey increases turnout. Now, the effects of answering pre-election surveys aren't quite this big. So the turnout rate in that verb condition is around 80%. It's 79%, which is way higher than the overall rate in New Jersey in that election, which was around 47%. So I think part of it is what you said. It's that answering any survey about the election tends to increase turnout. And part of it is that, and actually there's also evidence for this, people who do experiments tend to vote. And so that's another thing, right? So there's a certain degree to which we're selecting for conscientiousness or curiosity or something like that predicts voting. Yeah, that's right. And that's true in most of these voting, I guess probably all of these voting experiments. Yes?
Could it be that these are people who are willing to be manipulated by psychologists and
politicians? Yes. So I suppose that's, to some degree, that's a possibility in every experiment. It's less of an issue in this experiment because of the way these people were selected. So I mentioned this professional survey research firm. So they're apparently the gold standard in random sampling, right? In getting a sample that isn't biased in favor of any particular group. And so the way they do that is they make sure things like income don't affect it. So this is internet research. So you'd think income, for example, would prevent people who can't afford an internet connection from being part of the sample. They take care of that. They recruit people, and then they say, we'll pay for your internet connection if you'll be in our sample. Right? So they do things like this to try to make sure that they're really selecting as randomly as possible. And so in this case, so as experiments go, this one is least susceptible to that. I wouldn't go probably as far as to say totally unsusceptible to it. Yeah?
I'm wondering, because you're framing the research that you've done in the context of producing positive behavior, and I'm mostly worrying as I watch it about the ways it can be used to manipulate for advertising and for political outcomes that scare the hell out of me.
Right. Well, yeah. So I thought you were going to go a different direction, in which case I was going to say, don't worry, wait till the end. But you're right that there's flexibility in how these things are used. So a clever marketer could, for example, link a really harmful behavior with a positive identity and have really, really bad effects. I mean, think of smoking marketing, for example, right? Okay, I'm gonna move on just to make sure that we don't run out of time. Yeah, we're doing well. Okay. Okay, so across these two studies, big effects. In fact, I don't think I said this when I was showing you the previous graph, but just to give you a little bit of a sort of a benchmark to compare these effects to, there have been two major policy initiatives in the past 15 years or so to increase voter turnout in the United States. Motor voter laws, which make it easier to register to vote, and vote-by-mail laws, which allow people to simply mail their vote in rather than going to the polls. Both of those, by all accounts, have had smaller effects than this. So the upper end of the estimates of the effects of both of those policies is in the 6 to 7 percentage point range. And so an increase in voting anywhere near the magnitude we've observed in these studies could have a considerable effect on election outcomes, for one thing. So it's possible, taking into account the question over here about, for example, are these people who are unusually susceptible? And just generally, it's possible that the effect at a large scale wouldn't be quite this big. So for the sake of argument, let's take a third of the effect we observed here. Okay? If the losing side in every House, Senate, and governor's race in 2010 had been able to increase its vote total by a third of what we were seeing in these experiments, 3 Senate races, 23 House races, and 8 governor's races would have turned out differently. And if national voter turnout had been increased by this amount, 4.5 million more people would have voted in that election. And so I think these studies really illustrate how putting the self on the line, so to speak, tapping into people's strong desire to see themselves as good, efficacious, worthy people, can have motivational effects that are both personally significant, right? Getting people to take a half hour or an hour and a half out of their day to go and vote in the election, and potentially important at the policy or aggregate level. Now, in light of these results, I wondered how general this phenomenon is. For a number of reasons, voting was a really great behavior to use as an initial test of these ideas. But if my broader theory is right, this effect should occur for any behavior that's approved of and can be seen as an indication of the kind of person one is. And so I wanted to look at whether this effect, that's the bullet point for what I was just saying. But I wanted to look at whether this effect would occur in a very different context, a very different population, trying to motivate a very different sort of behavior. It's also interesting to consider how early in life people start actively managing their self-concepts in this way. We know from past work in developmental psychology that children as young as preschool age have a sense of themselves as good or bad. And my collaborators and I thought that the psychology I've been talking about, so seeking out or attempting to claim positive identities, also occurs that early. Think, for example, about parents who try to get their children to behave by urging them to act more like a big boy or a big girl. I think that's very much the psychology I've been talking about. And so we looked at trying to motivate helping behavior in young children. And so in an experiment with developmental psychologist Allison Master, who was a student here and is now at the University of Washington, and Greg Walton, a social psychologist here at Stanford, we looked at whether the desire to claim the identity helper could be a way to motivate helping behavior in preschool-age children. So the participants in this experiment were 4- and 5-year-old children at Bing Nursery School. Bing, for those of you who don't know, Bing is a research nursery school here at Stanford. So parents give blanket consent for kids to participate in innocuous experiments like this one. Our manipulation, so we randomly assigned the children to one of 2 groups, the helping group or the helper group. The helping group had the following short conversation with the experimenter, or rather I should say the experimenter delivered the following short spiel to the children. Some children choose to help. You could help when someone needs to pick things up. You could help when someone has a job to do. And you could help when someone needs help. Now, you'll probably notice that there are 4 references to the verb help in this paragraph. In the helper condition, the noun condition, we replace those with the predicate noun, be a helper. We also had a group of children to whom we didn't talk about helping at all. And the idea here was we were interested in how this noun and verb condition would compare to how much children helped spontaneously without any mention of helping. Next, the experimenter introduced the children to some fun new toys. Now, the idea behind this was to provide a fun alternative to helping, so that helping would feel costly, not like the most interesting thing available to do in the room, right? Important. And then after they were fully engaged in playing with these toys, and the toys are fun, and you'll see them in a video I'm about to show. After they were fully engaged in playing with the toys, they were presented with 4 opportunities to help. So first, the experimenter noticed that there were some blocks on the floor that needed to be picked up. And the children could help her or they could not help her. And they were given some prompts, you'll see. Next, she needed some help, this experimenter, to put something into a storage bin. And because her hands were full, she was having trouble doing it. And the children could help or they could not help. Third, it came time to put away those fun new toys so the children could do some drawing. This is one of the drawings one of the children did. And we just coded whether or not the children helped to put away the toys. And then finally, while they were drawing, the experimenter accidentally on purpose knocked over the cup of crayons, and we coded whether or not the children helped to pick them up. So now I will slide my computer over and plug in the audio.
How many children were in this experiment?
So it was 54 total. Yeah, it took a long time. It's not like running an online study with adults where you do it in 24 hours. Okay, so what I'm going to do then is show you a short video, and for the sake of time, I'm only showing you the first 2 of those 4 opportunities to help, the picking up the blocks and then the helping with the storage bin. I'll show you 1 child from each condition. And before I start it, I'll answer this question.
So we could see better.
Oh,
Yeah,
can
right behind you.
right behind me.
Go to like projection or display. Should kill the front things.
Oh yeah, I'll leave it like this. Should I leave it like this for the rest of okay.
No, they need it up for video.
Oh, need it up for the video. Sorry. Okay. Okay. Well, I will. Here we go. So just to make sure you got the context, it says verb condition. So this boy's just finished having that short conversation. His was about helping. Okay, and now you'll see him engaged in playing. Okay, so he would have been coded as not having helped.
Yeah, but he paid attention to what he was doing. Do your students pay that kind of attention?
Well, not all of them. Yeah, that's a good point. Okay, so now I'm going to show you a video of a child from the helper condition. So she's just had a discussion about being a helper. And just because I know the question is going to be on some of your minds, no gender effects. Girls didn't help more than boys overall. Girls didn't respond to the manipulation more strongly than boys either. Okay? Here we go. Okay. Unplug this now. Okay, great. So, oh, question?
Did you not thank her?
No, yeah. So we didn't let the experimenter thank any of the children until the very last helping opportunity to make sure there wasn't any kind of reinforcement. Yes.
This, what you showed us, has a distinct bias. The
Uh-huh.
bias is the boy versus the girl.
Uh-huh.
And we know that females are generally more helpful anyway.
Right.
So naturally, you might get that outcome.
Yeah, so that's why I made sure to tell you at the beginning there were no gender differences in this
Well,
experiment.
I heard that, but
Yeah.
that's what I saw.
Yes. So that's right. Yeah. Any other questions? Oh, do I need to?
Yes.
Okay. No, all on.
Yes.
Okay.
Did you think about doing this with a male teacher
Uh,
instead of a female teacher?
We didn't think about it just because research assistants are hard to come by, especially incredibly good ones like this one. So, and you saw evidence of how incredibly good she was. She was very consistent across children. She never reinforced children who helped early on. These sorts of things are really important. So no, but for practical reasons. Do you think it might be different with a male
Perhaps
teacher?
a little boy might want to help
Oh yeah,
a big guy out if he
sure.
respects the man, it's a role model to him.
Right. Yeah. So this of course is the downside of showing videos instead of the data across conditions. But remember, these people are randomly assigned to condition. So there are going to be an equal number of girls and boys in the two conditions. So none of these gender things are going to be relevant to the group results. Yes.
I noticed though that the girl was already sort of semi-verbally engaging
Yeah.
to help the woman, the tester. So she may have been cued better to the verbal clues coming back from that
Right.
help was needed, whereas the little boy was completely focused on the task.
He was, yeah. So we coded.
Overall,
Yeah, overall we coded for that. So that's the kind of thing where, not because it would necessarily be a confound, but it might be an interesting, way in which this is happening. Do people who are, looking out for ways to be helpers, are they more attentive to opportunities? That may be. We didn't find evidence for that in our coding, so we had a person watch all the videos and just rate, how attentive is the child to the experimenter throughout the session? How much does the child look at her? Those sorts of things. We didn't find differences. But I wouldn't have been surprised to find them either. Yeah. Yeah.
Was there any sort of follow-up about whether or not that helping behavior was consistent or inconsistent with how the child was in the classroom regularly?
Oh, no, because random assignment makes that very unlikely, right? So because they were randomly assigned, you expect these sorts of individual difference factors to even out in the mix. I thought you were going to ask something different, which is, did we follow up to see whether they kept on being more helpful? Oh, that is what you were asking. Oh, I'm dying to do that. That was why I wanted to do the child study in the first place, because I thought, wow, maybe we could get them on this really cool trajectory. Turns out, nightmare to do logistically. You get them out of this room and you put them back in the classroom, and it's just a huge mess. I mean, so I would love to do that, and I'm still hoping that we'll be able to do it at some point, but didn't do it in this first study, and it's something that's still very much on my mind. Okay, let me show you the results for the group as a whole. So remember, there were three groups. There were the two groups I showed you, the helper group and the help group, and then there was the group to whom we didn't mention helping at all, right? This is supposed to be an indication of how much the children in these classrooms help spontaneously. And what we found was that first, children in the noun or helper condition helped significantly more often than children in the verb or help condition. They also helped significantly more often than children were helping spontaneously, so children to whom we hadn't said anything about helping. And then interestingly, the verb condition where we talked about helping had no apparent effect, right? So they're helping about as much as children when you don't talk about helping. And so what this suggests is that children as young as 4 and 5 are already seeking out these sorts of desirable identities and thinking on some level at least about the kind of person they are and playing an active role in shaping that view of themselves. Okay, so the premise of, how am I doing on time? Okay, I have time. Perfect. Okay, so the premise of all of the studies I've told you about so far is that people are motivated to claim positive or desirable identities. But that's not the only way people manage their self-concepts, right? I expect that they're also highly motivated to avoid negative identities. And so when they see a potential behavior as diagnostic of a negative identity, I expect they'll want to avoid engaging in that behavior. Now, the slide I'm about to show is a little bit upsetting, and I hesitated a little bit to put it in, but I think it's worth showing because it helps to illustrate another important way in which this sort of framing can have an impact in society. And so what this is this ad is part of a recent anti-date rape campaign in Canada. And the campaign is targeted at men. The idea is to prevent men from attempting this crime in the first place. Typical campaigns focus on educating women about how to avoid it. These guys thought, well, maybe we can just prevent the men from trying it in the first place. The picture depicts a common scenario in which date rape occurs. So this woman is passed out drunk, unable to say no. And what's interesting is the slogan that goes with this picture and that goes in all of these ads, which is, "Don't be that guy." Right? And so the people behind this ad suspected, I imagine, and I agree, that men would be less likely to commit such a harmful act if they were forced to confront the implications it would have for their view of themselves. And so in the next set of studies, I examined an idea that's related to this, the idea that, in this case, I'm using nouns to make things about identity, right? So nouns that threaten a negative identity, that frame a harmful or disapproved behavior as relevant to the self-concept, will deter that behavior. And my collaborators and I looked at the effect of noun wording on cheating. We figured people may feel comfortable cheating from time to time, but nobody wants to think of himself or herself as a cheater. And so in a first experiment looking at this idea, we used 53 native English speakers who were approached on Stanford campus. They were offered the chance to win $5 if they'd be willing to participate in a short experiment. The manipulation, the experimental manipulation was embedded in the instructions that followed, which means that we randomly assigned people to receive one set of instructions or the other. In the verb condition, the instructions were, we're interested in how common cheating is on college campuses. We're going to play a game in which we will be able to determine the approximate rate of cheating in the group as a whole, but it will be impossible to know whether you're cheating. In the noun condition, and let me point out there are 3 references here to the verb cheating. The noun condition, we changed those to the noun cheater. Interested in how common cheaters are. We'll be able to determine the approximate number of cheaters, and it'll be impossible to know whether you're a cheater. Next, participants were asked to think of a number between 1 and 10, but not reveal it right away. They were told that they would receive $5 if the number they were thinking of was even. Now, the choice to pay for even numbers rather than odd actually wasn't arbitrary, and that's because there's past research to suggest that when you ask people to think of a number between 1 and 10 or any similar task, people actually have a strong bias toward thinking of odd numbers. In fact, a large plurality thinks of the number 7. And so this worked well for our purposes because by making even numbers the winning numbers, we were able to set it up so that a large number of our participants would be in the position of having thought of an odd number and needing to decide whether or not they were going to cheat. And then we just asked them to reveal their number. Now, what we're interested in here is the percentage of people in each of the 2 groups, the noun group and the verb group, who claim to have thought of an even number. So participants in the verb condition were more than twice as likely to claim to have thought of an even number than those in the noun condition. Excuse me. And it looks like there was a really strong bias among our participants in favor of thinking of odd numbers, right? Because the participants in the noun condition, which presumably was eliminating cheating or reducing cheating, only about 23% of them claimed to have thought of an even number. Now, one challenge, of course, in interpreting these results is that we don't know how strong the bias was in favor of odd numbers. So we really don't know how much people were cheating in either of these groups, right? We assume that at a minimum the number of people who were thinking of odd numbers or even numbers was around 23%, but we don't know. And so that's one thing we'd like to know. What are the absolute levels of cheating in these 2 groups? Another thing we'd like to know has to do with the direction of the effect. So in the helper study, I had a condition in which we didn't mention helping at all. It'd be nice to have a condition like this in one of these cheating studies so that we can confirm our assumption that what's happening here is that people in the noun condition are cheating less and not that for some reason we couldn't think of, people in the verb condition were cheating more. A third thing we'd like to know has to do with how important this face-to-face interaction was. So remember, unlike some of my studies, the voting studies in particular, in this case, people are talking to a person face-to-face, And essentially, they're put in this odd position, and some of you kind of laughed when I read the instructions. They're put in this odd position of potentially being called a cheater to their face by this experimenter, if only by implication, right? And so we thought that might be a really powerful thing, and so we wondered, how important is that? Could we get a similar effect when people weren't face-to-face with someone who was calling them a cheater by implication, or threatening to call them a cheater, I should say. And so we tried to address all of these questions, to try to answer all of these questions in a follow-up experiment. First thing we did was we used a new task, coin flipping. Clear expected outcome in the absence of cheating, right? So unlike thinking of even numbers where we don't know what the bias is, we don't know, here we know if I ask you to flip a coin 10 times, on average, a group of people is going to get 5 heads and 5 tails. We added a baseline condition like in the helper study where we didn't talk about cheating at all. This lets us confirm our assumption that what's happening here is that the noun condition is reducing cheating. We ran the study online, not face-to-face with an experimenter this time. This time, people are sitting in the comfort and privacy of their living rooms or offices or wherever they were, and they don't have to face anyone, the person they'll be cheating. So they were cheating us out of money. Now, we wanted them to cheat us out of money, otherwise we couldn't get a good result. But still, they were cheating us out of money, and they didn't know we wanted them to. And then the last thing we did in this study that was new was we tested a slightly bolder prediction. So this time we embedded this manipulation of noun versus verb in a direct request for honesty. And the reason that's a bolder prediction is now we're looking at whether using noun wording will reduce cheating even when participants in both of these wording conditions are directly being asked, please don't cheat. And we ask them really quite strongly, as you'll see. And so the question is, will noun wording still be more effective? So participants in this experiment were 99 native English-speaking Facebook users. So we wanted a totally anonymous sample. We didn't even use, we have a sort of a web pool of participants, but we wanted people who had zero relationship with us, zero relationship with the university. And the reason for that is we really wanted this to feel anonymous and private. When participants clicked on, what we did was we put an ad on the website and people clicked on it. People who clicked on it were told, okay, thanks, this is going to be a study of psychokinesis, which of course is a person's ability to influence the movement of physical objects with his or her mind. We told them that a psychologist, and this is true, a psychologist at Cornell had recently published in a highly regarded scientific journal what he claimed was the first scientific evidence for paranormal phenomena. Pardon me?
Duke University.
Cornell. Yeah. Darrell Bem at Cornell. We went on to say critics expect that these findings, this support for paranormal phenomena won't hold up as more research is conducted, and we subtly signal that we count ourselves among those critics. Yeah. Right, and so we're essentially saying we're going to run a study that's supposed to test for these paranormal phenomena, and we don't think they're real, and we don't expect to find evidence for them. We said, okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to have you flip a coin 10 times and try to influence the outcome with your mind. And just to make sure nobody can claim that we didn't motivate you properly to really concentrate on influencing the outcome of the coin toss, we're going to pay you $1 for every time your coin comes out heads. And what we did was we manipulated the instructions that followed. So in the verb condition, we said, note, please don't cheat and report that one or more of your coin flips landed heads when it really landed tails. Even a small amount of cheating would undermine the study, making it appear that psychokinesis is real. And you can see there are 2 references here to the verb cheat. And in the noun condition, we replaced those with the noun cheater. Please don't be a cheater and report that one or more of your coin flips landed heads when it really landed tails. Even a small number of cheaters would undermine the study. Next, on the next page, they were asked to flip the coin and report the outcome of each of their coin tosses. Immediately above the place where they were asked to report that, it said in large red letters, please don't cheat, or please don't be a cheater. Okay. Again, so now in this experiment, what we're interested in is how many heads people will claim to have obtained, right? And here's what we found. So replicating the previous study, participants in the verb condition claimed to have obtained significantly more heads than those in the noun condition. Right? Don't cheat wasn't as effective as don't be a cheater. People in the noun condition also reported significantly fewer heads than those in the condition where we didn't mention cheating at all. And then kind of surprisingly, the verb-based appeal, please don't cheat, had no apparent effect at all. Right? So they're cheating at almost exactly the rate at which people are cheating when we don't ask them not to. Now, remember I mentioned one of the cool things about using a coin toss is that now we have a clear expected outcome in the absence of cheating, right? 5. Did it show up? Yes, good. We can compare each of these conditions to 5. And what we see is that in the noun condition, that number, although a little higher than the line, is not significantly different from 5. Okay? But the verb bar is significantly different from 5. So here we have fairly strong evidence for actual cheating going on. And the cheating rate is about the same in the verb condition and in that no appeal baseline condition. Now remember, oh yeah, that was a question.
What is the number on the y-axis?
Oh, sorry, what's the number associated with which bar?
On the y-axis.
Oh, what is that number? Number of heads reported. It's the title of the slide here.
Oh,
Sorry. Out of 10, exactly, yeah, sorry. That's right. Right, so 5 is the expected number, and then this is, yeah, that's right. Right, so I was just saying that it's fairly surprising that this don't cheat appeal had no effect, especially when you remember how emphatic the appeal not to cheat was, right? There was an exclamation point in it. We told them it was going to ruin our research if they did it, and they still did it. But this tiny difference in wording apparently totally eliminated cheating. And so the way I think about this is I remember that participants are doing this online. And so the verb condition, or in the verb condition rather, the most salient reason not to cheat may have been that someone I don't know and don't care about is asking me not to. But in the noun condition, that noun phrasing shifts the rationale to something most people care a lot about. Cheating will say something about them. It would saddle them with the identity cheater. And as I said when I started talking about this, nobody wants to think of himself or herself as a cheater. And more broadly, this suggests that while this sign seems like it should be perfectly adequate, this one's probably more effective. And actually, even this one isn't great because that litter bug appears to be reformed. And he's kind of cute. And so what you really want is something like that, right? Nobody wants to be that guy. And so just to sum up, we've seen that tying approved behavior, voting and helping, to the self motivates that behavior as people seek to claim positive or desirable views of themselves. Tying disapproved behavior, cheating, to the self deters that behavior as people seek to avoid a negative view of themselves. And more broadly, framing behavior as relevant to the self-concept as a potential indication of the kind of person one is encourages should behaviors. That is, it gets people to behave in ways they know they should behave but often don't want to. And this is especially important because that's the sort of behavior that's at the heart of many of society's most difficult and challenging policy problems. If you think, for example, about environmental behavior, recycling, conserving energy, or health behavior, exercising, eating healthy. These are things that most people know they should be doing, but they just never seem to bother. And so I think that by linking these behaviors to people's strong desire for positive self-regard, it might be possible to make a real difference on these fronts. Now, I think these ideas are going to generate a lot more research in the future, and I just want to tell you briefly about some of the most exciting avenues I'm pursuing now. So I'm working on two main fronts. One involves extending this work to other important contexts. So one of those contexts is health behavior. I alluded to it a second ago. I'm working on a study now in which we're trying to get people to make healthier food choices by catching them in the line at a local Subway sandwich restaurant and giving them a short questionnaire about their thoughts and attitudes about being a healthy eater or eating and then, of course, we're going to track what they buy. Because psychologists are sneaky. That's one thing you have to learn if you're going to think like a psychologist. Another involves extending this to another domain that seems ripe for extensions of this work. We're going to try to get people to use less energy by putting door hangers on their front doors that urge them not to be an energy hog. So you'll notice I'm taking the negative approach in the energy study, right? Instead of saying, be an energy saver, for example. It's because I tried be an energy saver and it didn't work at all. And you know why? Energy saver sounds really geeky. Nobody wants to be an energy saver. And so you have to be really careful about these things. So energy saver actually had a rebound effect, right? People said energy saver, I don't want to be that. So we're going with energy hog because we think that'll work better. Now, the second main avenue I'm pursuing involves drilling down to try to get more direct evidence for this self-based process I've been arguing is behind all of these effects. Now, remember that the premise of the theory I've been talking about is that people really want to see themselves as worthy. And so if it were possible to satisfy that drive, that desire, by some other means, you might be able to eliminate this effect. And if that were true, that would provide evidence that the reason the effect works is that people really want to see themselves as worthy. And so lucky for us, there's a canned way to do this in social psychology. It's called self-affirmation. You have people write a short essay reflecting on their important values, makes them feel like a really good person. And so the prediction is that you get people to do one of these self-affirmations, it makes my effect go away. People already feel like a good person. They don't have such a need to feel like a voter. And so I'm working on that now. And so just to conclude, taken together, I think these experiments support the broader theoretical perspective that the self is a constant work in progress. We're continually managing our self-concepts through our behavior, acting in ways that allow us to build up our sense of ourselves as competent and worthy. And as we've seen, this psychological process can be channeled to influence important socially relevant behavior in a wide range of domains. Thank you.
Probably the two things that stand out to the most to me, and I think that's probably broadly consistent with psychology research and trends in psychology research today. This idea that how we think and the language we use has a very powerful impact on us, and also challenging the idea that who we are is a fixed trait or a fixed self. Okay, so with that in mind, now let me turn and ask you an easier question. That was kind of a hard question. This first question is always an easy one. You mentioned Bem's research on psychokinesis and predicting the future and all of that. So do you actually think that that research is junk? As you said in your study, you said you don't think it's true, and I'm just personally curious. Do you think that there's anything to that research?
This is going to be online, right?
It is. So be kind.
No, I don't. I don't know. I have no idea. There have been criticisms of it on statistical grounds. Not that he did anything that the rest of us don't do, but that some of the sort of norms about the way we test things statistically are flawed when you're testing a hypothesis that is extremely improbable, right? And people have taken this as an argument for taking account of how likely the thing is to be true in how we evaluate evidence that it is true. And so I think that was a good diplomatic answer.
So we should hold the highly improbable to a higher statistical standard.
That's
than
the argument.
merely
I'm not
probable.
endorsing it.
Yeah.
But that's the argument. Yeah.
Yeah. So not P.05.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Now I don't know Daryl Bem personally, but I know people who know him, and it seems like the things you automatically think of as how you get something like this to appear significant if it's not true, he didn't do. So the most obvious one is so basically what statistical significance means is it's extremely improbable that we would see this pattern of data if this weren't in fact true in the world, right? And so extremely improbable has a specific definition, and the criterion we use is less than 5% chance. So the obvious way to get a working study, a study that has a statistically significant difference, even when there's no real effect out there, is to run 20 studies and take the one that worked by chance and report that. So he didn't do that. We're pretty sure. I think it's fair to say he didn't do that. So I mean, I definitely don't discount it. I mean, he had 6 or 7 studies showing evidence. Now, it wasn't, for those of you who don't know, do they know?
No, you probably don't.
So the study wasn't about psychokinesis. It was about, I don't know why we called it psychokinesis instead of telekinesis, which is what everyone calls it. But it was about precognition. So it's the idea that people can anticipate things that are about to happen. And so,
but it's a really interesting phenomenon in the world of scientific psychology because most scientific psychologists do not believe that that's possible. And yet, published in a very prominent journal were these studies suggesting that it is occurring to a small degree. And I remember when he was here, I don't know, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, presenting that data, it was a conundrum because, part of thinking like a psychologist is you listen to the data. And that's, sort of you worship at the altar of data, not at your own biases.
Right.
And I know many of us in the audience, we were, there's data, and then there's our deep-seated belief that this is impossible. And
it's a very uncomfortable experience for people who are...
But that's actually kind of fun, and that's, since this is our last class on how to think like a psychologist, I think that's actually the most exciting moment sometimes when you're looking at the data and it's totally not what you would expect, and you get to decide, am I going to be somebody who has an open enough mind to listen to the data or close it.
Yeah. And he's an incredibly brilliant psychologist, so I wouldn't discount it. By the way, that's why we have tenure, so people can study things like this.
Okay, so moving on. Okay, so this is going to be like a lightning round.
Okay.
So you mentioned in your study that asking people to think of themselves as an energy saver did not seem to motivate conserving energy.
Right.
So I'm going to give you what the survey suggests are the most common New Year's resolutions.
Okay.
And I'm going to ask you to come up with a noun.
Oh, man. You know how long I spend coming up with these nouns for these studies?
You can
2 weeks for one.
Okay, so here's the deal. You can say pass, but you can also, what do they say in Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? What is it you ask the audience? You can do an audience lifeline if you don't know, and we'll take nominations from the crowd.
Okay.
So, and you get bonus points if you can think of a noun that wouldn't work, the noun that we shouldn't try to use. So this is presumably like my New Year's resolution is going to be, I am this kind of a person. I am this noun. It's not going to be about the behavior.
Oh, man.
It's good. Come on, you can do it.
Terribly at this.
I thought this would be fun. Okay, here we go. Okay.
Okay.
Saving money.
Yeah, so I've worked on trying to, I get to stall, right? So
Yeah.
I've worked on trying to get people to save money, and I've used an approach that's completely different from this. I don't think saver, I haven't been convinced that it wouldn't work, but I don't think it works. To me, intuitively, you hear be a saver, it doesn't sound like something I want to be. It doesn't sound cool, it doesn't sound appealing, really. It's, I'm trying to think if there's a negative. I'm not going to get this one because I've wanted to do this for saving for a long time. I haven't come up with one, but.
So what's the negative identity we want to avoid? Don't be a.
If I had that, I would have.
Don't be a spendthrift. Can we ask?
Wealth accumulator?
Yeah. How about this? I'm going to be a wealth accumulator. How about a wealth magnet? How about 2 others?
I'm going to be in the 1%. Is that
audience?
what you said?
What would be motivating to you? What's an identity? I'm going to be money savvy.
So that's interesting. I've wondered about
It's a trait.
adjectives.
Yeah.
I've wondered whether adjectives work. I suspect they work almost as well as nouns. Yeah, because they characterize a person.
I'm a money savant. How about that?
I don't know.
Okay, well, how about this?
I told you it was hard.
I know it's hard. It's fun.
Yeah.
How about I want to be happier in the new year?
Oh. Well, I mean, you can say I want to be a happy person. I think the trick then is you link it to specific behaviors.
Yeah.
You can. I think that there's a delicate balance here, and this maybe addresses your issue. You were really worried that this sort of thing could be used for evil, and I share your worry. I don't dismiss it, but I think one useful thing is that you really have to think carefully. It's not sort of the easiest thing to come up with a noun that's going to work. And so every now and then I think of one, I'm like, that kind of dictates what I study. Right? I'm like, oh man, Patriot, perfect. Connect patriot to something and these sorts of things. But happy person is so abstract that I think people can just too easily reject your link of the behavior to it, right? And that's right. There's no rejecting that voting makes you a voter. There's no rejecting that helping makes you a helper, or at least it's not easy and obvious to reject it. Same with cheating. But if I said, go work out, it'll make you a happy person, you might say, so will eating this cookie.
This is true.
Yeah.
Well, let me give you one more, but you actually segued into my second question. But do you got one for procrastination? I'm not going to procrastinate anymore.
Yeah, so procrastinate. So you could imagine procrastinator. I've thought of, this is not exactly the same thing, but I thought quitter would be a good one.
I'm not
So don't be a quitter. We actually wanted to run that one with kids, but I told you that we had blanket consent to do innocuous studies, and Bing wasn't convinced that would be innocuous for the kids.
What was their concern?
Well, they didn't like the idea of us putting the notion of that one can be a quitter in these 4- and 5-year-old kids' heads. Not because they would become one necessarily, but it's a lot of, I mean, you can imagine, in fact, what we
Like that voice would be in their head 10 years from now, like saying,
maybe,
you're such a quitter.
Yeah, I mean, you have
What's
to be
wrong with
really
you?
thoughtful about these. When you're doing studies with little children, I mean, things that seem innocuous when you're not very thoughtful can really be problematic. And so we decided, okay, we're not going to do quitter because quitter is going to resonate with things they'll hear in the world later on, and that's dangerous. So let's try stopper. Well, this was the suggestion that Bing gave us, and we thought, well, it's something, so we'll try it. And it didn't really, it sort of worked, but not well enough that I, claim it worked.
What about being a doer then?
But
Being
wait,
okay.
but with stopper, I think it worked on some of the kids in a way that made me, we scaled back the way we were doing it, because we said, so what we did was, okay, people don't automatically think stopper's a bad thing. So fortunately, these are little kids, and we can communicate to them whether it's good or not. So we trained our experimenter to communicate this with her tone of voice. So she would say, stoppers just give up when things are hard. Stoppers just give up when they're tired. That sort of thing. And then we had them do this puzzle that was designed for like 12-year-olds. It's really, I mean, it took me and my collaborator like 20 minutes to do the puzzle. And we just looked at how long they'd spent working on it, and they had up to 8 minutes. And one of our pilot subjects, we're sitting there with the Bing people, and we're watching one of our pilot subjects, and most kids got 0 pieces right. Okay, so that's how hard it was. And this girl was just so torn. So we said, okay, if you want to be a stopper, we had this little stopper sign. It was a stop sign. It was a stop sign. And we said, if you want to be a stopper, just point to the stop sign. And she sat there for the full 8 minutes, and she kept looking at the stop sign, and then she went back and she worked on it and furrowed her brow, and we were like, we need to change this. So we kept, it was a maximum of 5 minutes. We made it a lot easier by putting an outline of the pieces in, and then we got to a point where nobody was miserable and we felt comfortable. But so
that may not be a good parenting strategy for these folks to
yeah,
take
no,
home.
so, I mean, I think especially when you're starting to talk about these sort of identity-related things, it's really, you have to be careful. I mean, helper seems totally innocuous. We were fine doing that. Stopper, when we, got to a point where, and so, by the way, I should say, she didn't leave feeling terrible about herself. We had like a 20-minute debriefing session where we said, it's okay to ask for help when you need help, and that's a totally, healthy thing to do, and it's, that sort of thing. So she, she felt fine after. But anyway, the point is, was there a question? Sorry.
Did you apologize for giving them such a hard puzzle?
No. We couldn't do that at the beginning because it would suggest that it was okay to. But at the end we did. Yeah. Well, not only that, but we helped them do it.
Oh,
so they had the success experience, and so they weren't stoppers, and we told them that even if you were, that would actually be a perfectly acceptable thing, and we did all kinds of things to make sure that they weren't hurt by it. But yeah.
So you had mentioned patriot as being a positive identity in our culture, and actually was curious if you knew of other positive identities or negative identities that have really strong pull in our culture that we just might be able to think about when we're thinking about trying to influence people or connecting specific behaviors to really important identities in our culture.
Yeah, so I think, some of the ones, I don't think voter is one of those, actually. So it was a great way to test these things for reasons unrelated to how, much of an iconic identity is. I think cheater is a big one. And I think things like glutton, things that like have a lot of emotional resonance, right? Cheater, glutton, the negative ones tend to be really strong. And then, healthy eating. Very few of the positive ones. I mean, patriot. Patriot is one. It's so vaguely defined that's why I haven't done that study yet. Is that you haven't come up with the right behavior to tie to it. But it's actually interesting to note that a lot of the really powerful ones are negative.
The healthy eating thing is really interesting. I was just looking today at the Daniel Project. Do you know this? Or the Daniel Plan? This is Rick Warren of Saddleback Church and Daniel Ammon's big program to try to convince people who attend church to become healthy eaters by linking the behaviors of exercising and eating healthy with being a good Christian. And why is that funny?
Yeah.
It's a really big program that they're rolling out.
That's really
And they take sections from the Bible that talk about eating well and taking care of your body and all of that. And
the idea is your body's not yours to abuse.
Yeah, and that also that taking good care of yourself will allow you to fulfill your role as a spouse, a partner in community, and that how you take care of your body is a reflection of your relationship with God and with your community.
There have been interesting. That just reminds me of an interesting, I think, unrelated effort to encourage environmental conservation in this way, right? By appealing to the notion of stewardship, which is an obligation. Anyway.
I just think it's a really interesting program because they're looking around like what are the core identities that people actually care about because nobody seems to care about being a healthy eater.
Yeah.
And can you take these things that are very important to a sense of who you are and then link them to behaviors that otherwise would have been rejected?
So I'll tell you why I think people do care about being a healthy eater. And I should say that healthy eater study, I'm actually designing it with the positive and the negative version. So one interesting question is whether being an unhealthy eater is more motivating, avoiding that is more motivating than the desire to be a healthy eater. The reason I think this one's going to work has less to do, so the ones I talked about all had some like pretty strong moral undertone, right? So being a voter is sort of it's a societal obligation or civic obligation. Helper is obvious, right? This is pro-social behavior and we're supposed to help our peers or help other people generally. And cheater obviously has moral implications. The healthy eater one, now you just talked about a way in which it can have moral implications. I was thinking of it as powerful because another implication of framing a behavior as reflective of an identity, of your sort of underlying character, is that it's, in kind of an ironic way, it relies on exactly this notion of an essential self that you said that all of this work, including my own, suggests isn't accurate, right? But it's a very strong sort of popular culture notion, right? That people have these essential selves that dictate how they behave, and so by tying a behavior like making bad food choices to identity, you're essentially implying that this one food choice you're about to make has implications for all of your food choices. It suggests generally that you are either a healthy or an unhealthy eater, and that's not a very long leap from there to how long am I going to live? And so I think that was part of the thinking behind the power of that particular one.
So one last question for you, and then I'll turn it over to these guys. You opened your talk by saying that we look for opportunities to do things that allow us to claim a certain identity. And as soon as you said that, what popped in my mind is, and we also look for opportunities to buy things, to claim.
Oh, yeah.
And I was wondering if you thought, is that a cop-out, or is that something that we should be intentionally manipulating? Well, I know that people are, yes. But what do you think about that? The idea that, is it easier to buy an identity than to do something, or?
I mean, yeah, it is easier. I think it's hard to buy the identities that really count, the important ones. I think you can buy, you can buy the identity of, well, actually that's not true. You can donate to charity. That's a little bit like buying an identity. But yeah, I also, I'm not sure I buy this. Maybe I'm being a little bit Pollyannish, but I suspect a little bit that the ones you buy don't last and don't resonate as strongly with yourself. Right? So there's a guy who does work that superficially not very similar to what I've done, but on a sort of a middle level it's similar, and then on the deeper level I think it's different again. But this guy, his name is Jonah Berger, and he's done work on, and he's a marketing researcher, and he's done work on getting people to make choices using these sorts of identity-based manipulations. And so what he does is he was actually a PhD student at Stanford, and so in the business school. And one thing he did was he got undergraduates to drink less by, I don't know if any of you are Stanford undergrads, but got undergraduates to drink less by showing them a picture of a kind of a skeezy looking graduate student drinking a beer and saying, don't be a sketchy grad student. And it worked, right? It worked. People drank less in that dorm than in the dorm next door where they didn't do that, right? And so this is a kind of, this, anyway, and then I'm trying to think if he's done positive. He hasn't done, I guess, positive versions. It's always been avoiding, in fact, it's often avoiding being confused with a graduate student. Apparently, that's the worst thing you could be.
If you have a bike helmet on, that's the dead giveaway on this campus.
That's right.
Actually, it reminds me of some research where researchers were looking at the effect on self-identity if you buy, what are they called, knockoffs? Like instead of buying a Gucci purse, I buy like a Nucci purse that has like, it's almost Gucci, but it's not.
Yeah, the counterfeit stuff.
The counterfeit stuff, yeah. And that even if other people were fooled into thinking it was Gucci, that it has a powerful downward effect on your own self-image because you know that you're carrying something that is counterfeit.
Yeah.
I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, it is interesting.
Unless your most powerful identity is as a bargain hunter, and then maybe it would make you feel really good.
Yeah, I think they framed the situation very explicitly as like, you're the kind of person who likes counterfeit goods, right? And so here, wear these fake Gucci sunglasses and walk around campus for a while, and then they were more likely to cheat or something like that.
Yeah. I didn't see that. Read that Barnes study. Okay, so it looks like these guys have questions. I'm calling people as you see fit, and I'll let you know when we're on the last question.
Okay, great. I think you're. Yes. Oh yeah, we were going to talk. Oh, and by the way, before I forget, someone mentioned that I should give my email address out. So it's CBRYAN, cbrian, at stanford.edu. Okay, so the work I'm doing on retirement saving is quite different from what I talked about. It still involves the role of the self in motivating behavior. And it has a little bit of a backstory. So there was work before I started working in this area on the idea. So first, the sort of basic premise, people don't save enough for retirement, right? It's a big problem. It's part of the reason why Social Security is in trouble, although not the only reason. So people don't save enough for retirement. One theory about why that is has to do with the way people think about themselves in the future. Specifically, there's some pretty interesting and compelling evidence that people think about their distant future selves more in a way that's more similar to the way they think about other people than the way they think about themselves in the present, right? So if I'm thinking about myself in 30 years, I have an emotional reaction to that self, and I even make sort of cognitive judgments about that self that are more similar to the types of reactions I have to other people. And that has kind of an interesting implication, which is that to some extent then saving for that future self might feel a little more like giving money away than it does like investing in yourself. And that may help to explain why people aren't so motivated to do that. And so some of the coolest work in this area that I just described was by a friend of mine, and his name is Hal Hirschfield. and he was a student here, he did this. He showed, for example, that brain areas that tend to be active when we're thinking about other people are more active when we think about our future selves, but brain areas that tend to be active when we think about ourselves are more active when we think about ourselves. Anyway, so and then he thought, okay, well, we need to try to address this issue. Maybe we can get people to save more. And so the obvious approach is, okay, well, let's get people not to think of their future selves as other people. Let's convince them that their future selves are really them. That turned out to be really hard to do. He tried this really cool thing where there's software that will digitally age your face. So you take their pictures, digitally age them, put them in a virtual reality environment, and have them walk up to a virtual mirror and stare at their aged face in the mirror. And that actually does have some effect. And he was working on that for years, and at some point during those years, I said, hey, maybe it's okay that people think of their future selves as another person. People take care of other people all the time. And so maybe we could just tap into the type of motives that get people to take care of other people to motivate people to take care of their future selves. And so what we did was we recruited Stanford staff, who are benefits eligible Stanford staff, so people who are eligible to save in the retirement plan. We brought them in. We had them look up their current saving rate. Not everyone knows that, right? They looked up their current saving rate. Then we exposed them to one of two appeals. So in both appeals, we said, hey, people aren't saving enough for retirement generally. For most people, the recommendation is save more, as much more as you can. And then we manipulated what the final paragraph said. So in one paragraph, we said, we urge you to consider your long-term interest. What you do will determine how much money is available to you in retirement. So a fairly standard appeal based on long-term self-interest. And the other one, we instead said, we urge you to, so we essentially framed that future self as a different person, which we thought was going to be more consistent with the way they were already thinking. We said, we urge you to consider the duty you have to your future, or the responsibility you have to your future self. Your future self is completely dependent on you. What you do will determine your future self's something like that, financial security. So the idea was to tap into the sort of emotion that gets people to take care of their children, their neighbors, their aging parents, any number of close others. We also measured how close they felt to their future selves. So we gave them this questionnaire about how close they felt to that future self. And what we found was the responsibility appeal, this social responsibility appeal that tapped into obligations to other people, worked better than the self-interest appeal, but only for people who felt close to that future self. So some people feel distant from their future selves, and for them, the two were about equally effective and less effective. I think the coolest thing about that study was that we did it by measuring actual saving rates. So instead of saying, how much would you save in a hypothetical scenario, we got them to tell us how much they had been saving, and then they had given us consent to get access from the Stanford Benefits Office to anonymize data on actual saving rates, and so we were able to subtract and see how much each participant had increased their saving rates. Yes?
Well, another dynamic that I think might be going on is that I think most people like to imagine themselves as they get older as being in the group that is still going to be physically fit, is still going to be healthy, is still going to be mentally acute, because it's much pleasanter to picture yourself that way, and therefore it's easier to think that you aren't going to need as much money because you're still going to be able to take care of yourself, and you're still going to be able to, be independent.
Yeah.
To think about saving, really saving what you probably really will need involves imagining yourself having real physical and mental needs, and that's not pleasant to do.
It's, wow. It's so interesting that you raise that because that raises another project that I'm working on now. I don't have results to tell you about, but I can tell you the idea. And the idea is that what's called the misery myth, which is the notion that many people have that as you get older, you become less and less happy, and that retirement and old age generally are an unhappy, miserable time. Turns out there's lots of good data suggesting that that's simply not true. In fact, the opposite is true. Older people are happier, they revel more in the things they like, they focus on the things that are important, right? If you think about a person, a younger person, think about someone my age, right? I'm early in my career. All of my time is spent building for the future. And you know, it's not, I'm not saying that my life is miserable, but I'm working really hard. And I don't have as much time to enjoy the things I love. If I want to read a nice book, I mean, I almost never, I have a 1-year-old, so I almost never can, but, right? And that's the other thing, people are working and building for the future, and that includes raising children. I mean, life is really hectic. And so the misery myth is a myth, and the reason that's important for saving for retirement, I think, is that people, this is sort of like what you said, people don't want to think about the fact that they're going to be old because they think they're going to be miserable. And so what we think is that saving for retirement, actually like taking the steps necessary, logging into your account and saving, requires a sort of implicit acknowledgement that, hey, one day I'm going to be old. And people don't even want to think about that. It's like getting your child fingerprinted in case, you know, he or she should be kidnapped. People don't do that because they don't even want to think about it. Just get that away from me. I don't want to think about it. And so the idea is if we can debunk the misery myth, if we can, you know, convince people, hey, old age is something to look forward to in many ways, then that may help to remove that barrier and get people to take the steps that they need to take. Yeah.
I'd like to go back to maybe the essence of where you were going on this identity thing and connect it to, since I saw she was one of your collaborators, to Carol Dweck's work.
Oh, yeah.
And see at a deep level how you see these things relating. Because, you know, in these, you know, self-esteem studies, it was having an identity, using a noun.
Yeah.
In fact, being told a noun gave you something that you then became afraid of losing and became a negative.
Oh, she talked about the study with children where good drawer. Is that what you're thinking?
You're a smart person.
Oh, sure, yeah. You must be really smart. Yeah.
Sure. You work very hard.
Uh-huh.
You know, doing versus the noun.
Versus being, yeah.
And so that's the whole fundamental principle.
Yes.
So talk about the interesting interconnections of that and where you're going with this noun versus verb.
Yeah, so...
And this will be the last question. You got 3 minutes to try.
3 minutes, okay. So, yeah, it's a really good question. And I don't think it's one I fully answered myself, but I have thoughts about it. So I think one thing is that I am very much tapping into a psychology with a dark side, right? Because I'm talking about being a certain way, and I'm very much relying on this folk notion of, you know, there are kinds of people with essential qualities, and those essential qualities say something about who you are. And there's, I think, very closely associated with that is, and people don't change, right? This idea of essentialism is very closely linked to people don't change. And so I'm walking kind of a fine line, right? Because at the same time, on the flip side, right, and I think Kelly picked up on this in her intro, there's also this implication that you can become any of these things, and all it takes is, you know, for you to go and vote or help someone, and then suddenly you get to be this kind of person. And so I think, so I think that those are sort of the two sides of it. I think that the way the noun type treatments are used has implications for how people react to them. So the good drawer thing I mentioned was a study that Carol did with a student of hers a few years ago, before we did the helper one. what they did was this was again at Bing, and they did this role-playing thing, but essentially the idea is they talked about drawing well as being a good drawer or having drawn a nice picture. I don't remember the exact wording of the non-noun version. And then they gave the children a vicarious failure experience where a puppet who was supposed to be them drew. You have to be careful, right, to not give the kids any kind of traumatic experiences. So it was a puppet who was supposed to be them, drew a bus and forgot to put the wheels on. And oh my God, how embarrassing. And so the idea is this is a failure experience. So we've talked about drawing well as being a good drawer, and then there's this failure experience. And then they were interested in how much do you want to draw a picture now? Like how much would you want to draw a picture if you thought you weren't sure you could do it, that sort of thing. And good drawer was really problematic because what it does is it makes people think, oh geez, if I'm not a good drawer, that's really bad. It's one thing to not have drawn a nice picture, but it's really bad not to be a good drawer. And so in thinking about the helper study, we thought, well, is this going to have similar negative implications? And we concluded that we thought it wouldn't. And the reason is that you have more or less complete control over whether you're a helper, right? We've defined it as helping out. And so all you have to do to be a helper is to help. So it's totally a question of effort. Good drawer is evaluated externally. You don't have control, so it's a risk. If good drawer is an identity and you want to go after it, you're taking a risk because if you fail, then you're a bad drawer. And so those are some thoughts, some semi-coherent thoughts about the intersection of this with Carol's work.
Great. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.